Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 8. The Ladybug's First. Ruby considered it unfortunate that Remnant had chosen that night to remember that Vale was nearly a full month into winter, because as she stood at the gate that lead out of Beacon's campus, goosebumps began appearing on the smaller girl's exposed arms at the slight chill in the breeze that permeated the night air. A faint fog had already begun to cover the campus, the orange glow from the surrounding light posts causing it to take on a more eerie visage that made her happy that she still had Crescent Rose under her cloak. She had been waiting for a little over 20 minutes for her date, though admittedly that was because she had arrived much earlier than they had arranged, but with each minute that had gone by, she had found herself shivering more and more. While she knew it was mainly the cold that was causing it, there was a degree of nerves that she just couldn't shake. This was her first date, and as she had been getting ready, with Yang's teasing being a little less than usual, it dawned on her that she had absolutely no idea what she was doing. She knew fighting, combat with Grimm, she excelled in mechanics, and was apparently even a competent leader, yet a small thing like hanging out with someone she saw every day was completely baffling to her. What did she say? How did she act? Were there good and bad things to do? She had no idea. Yang had talked about going on dates many times in the past, but Ruby had never listened, never thought she even needed to, as her sister always made it feel like it was the most effortless thing in the world. It was only in the face of her first date that she realized that Yang may have, unsurprisingly, not been completely honest. I wonder if Blake is feeling the same right now, Ruby thought to herself, rubbing her hand up her arms in an attempt to warm herself up a little. The young fauness was due to arrive any minute, and Ruby had been checking by peeking down the path that led to the dormitories ever since she had looked at the time on her scroll to see it was only 5 minutes until Blake should arrive. Pulling out her scroll to check it again, she saw that there were only 2 more. Ruby? Caught off guard by the sudden familiar behind her, Ruby couldn't help but let out a squeak of surprise, and spun quickly to see her date standing there in a rather beautiful, black dress that cut off around her thighs. What looked like thick tights covered the girl's legs, and thin shawl covered her shoulders. As if she didn't already have enough worries about how good of a date she could be, Ruby suddenly felt underdressed and questions whether she should have gone for something a little more fancy than the same outfit she had worn to fight Torchwick and his mech, or as she had taken to calling it, Mecha Torchwick. Ah, she breathed, her thoughts of not quite knowing what to say coming true almost immediately. Hey, Blake. I didn't see you arrive. Sorry, I took a different way around, the girl replied quietly, the slight hint of nerves in her voice oddly making Ruby feel a little better. Oh, that's fine. Ruby knew that the path she had been staring down was by far the quickest way to, and from the dorm room, so for the girl to have taken another path showed that she too was clearly just as nervous. So feeling herself relax, just a little bit, she let out a foggy breath and gave Blake a small, albeit nervous smile that was returned in kind. So, the fauness replied after a couple of seconds, taking a slight step back. Are you ready to go? Giving the girl a small nod, Ruby joined her side, as the fauness began a gentle stride towards Beacon's gate. With Blake's long legs, and how effortlessly she usually walked, Ruby would normally have to quicken her pace a little. But thankfully, the girl seemed to be walking a little slower than she often did. Though even with her slowed pace, Blake still seemed to glide through the night like a ghost, making Ruby feel like she was stomping in comparison. So how was your afternoon? Blake asked just as they cleared the gate and began their trek down the dark road that led to Vale. It was okay. I sparred with Jan a little, Ruby replied, purposely leaving out that her sister had suggested it to take her mind off the date. How about you? I hung out with Sun and Neon a little bit. That's cool. Ruby smiled as she remembered an earlier conversation with Blake about that other cat fauness. Are you two getting along now? Huh? Blake said in a slightly confused for a second until her eyes widened a little in realization. Oh, that. It wasn't that we didn't get along, we just see things differently is all. In what way? Well, have you ever met someone who doesn't acknowledge the severity of a problem because they have never faced it themselves? She had in fact. While she had been training to be a huntress for years, she had met a couple of people who had regaled tales of their time and the atrocities they had seen, but she had also met groups of people who didn't believe the danger Grimm presented. Her father told her that the comforts of civilization had a tendency to make people a little more complacent, and that it wasn't uncommon to find those kinds of people among those who had been raised within the walls of a city. But he had also taught her something else. "I have," she replied with a nod. "But isn't that something that should be celebrated? So long as those who do face hardships aren't forgotten, doesn't every person not facing those hardships mean we're taking the right steps forward?" "I guess," Blake said after a second of thought, in which they passed a few second-year students, who gave them a small wave that they both returned. "But for everyone that doesn't, 100 do. It's just kind of frustrating to hear her say faunus are too miserable. I guess that would be kind of annoying." Ruby hummed with a nod, and glanced into the dark woods that lined one side of the road. "But I don't think you're miserable." "Really?" Blake smiled, though Ruby noticed the girls bow twitch slightly towards the direction they were headed. "Your sister seems to think I'm something called an emo." "What?" "Nah." Ruby scoffed and gave Blake a wave of her hand, despite knowing Blake did indeed show many of the same traits a self-proclaimed emo student from Signal Academy had. "She calls me a goth all the time, just a thing she says." "Fair enough," Blake replied with a small smile, and this time she was certain she did see Blake's bow-covered ear twitch this time as the girl gave a scowl. Turning to see what Blake was listening for and reaching back for her scythe, Ruby scanned the horizon for any red eyes or white armor but saw nothing. However, off in the distance, she heard a scream of terror that sounded strangely familiar. A couple of seconds passed, and the frantic scream echoed through the night again. This time Ruby instantly recalled the memory of John flying through the air on Initiation Day. Stopping in her tracks, Blake following suit, she listened intently as it got closer, almost as if he was running towards them. Suddenly, both of their heads turned to look at the sky to see a rather unique sight rising into the night sky. While at first Ruby mistook it for one of their rocket lockers, as it drew closer and burning brighter, she saw that it was actually a flaming porta-potty soaring some 40 to 50 feet in the air somehow. Enraptured by the sight, she had almost missed the realization she just had. "It's coming straight at us." After jumping back and out of range, their attention was yet again pulled to the edge of the woods where John emerged, his face sweaty and panicked as he ran straight for where the toilet was going to land, only to be pulled out of the way at the last second by a blur of red and gold. Exactly where his foot had been about to land, the large, plastic box slammed hard into the winter-hardened mud and exploded on impact. While random flying objects were not an uncommon occurrence at Beacon, Ruby could honestly say she had never seen a flying toilet, so was slightly intrigued at how such a thing had happened. Fortunately, the pair that she guessed were responsible were sitting on a nearby bench, Pyrrha maintaining a safe distance, as, even from where she stood, Ruby could see that the boy had not fully escaped what had exploded from the porta-potty. Suppressing a smile at the boy who was holding his hands above his head, as if to help not get any more of him, she gave Blake a look, earning a shrug in return, and headed over to see what had happened. "Hey, Pyrrha," she said happily, still suppressing the chuckle. "Having fun?" "We were," the girl replied with a deep sigh. "Just picking up some dust, but John decided to put the fire dust in with the lightning dust." "Well, how was I supposed to know that would happen?" he asked with a pout, and pulled some leaves off the tree to wipe himself down. "Or that the toilet would turn into a missile?" "We learned it 2 weeks ago in dust application," Blake said quickly with a raised eyebrow. "The dust thing, not the toilet thing." "Oh," he said, stopping his actions as he clearly began to think back. "Well, I forgot. I should get him back to the school to clean up," Pyrrha said sadly, Ruby knowing that the girl would have preferred a night with John to end on a different note than what they had just witnessed. "Have a good night." Pyrrha stood up and motioned for John to follow her back up the path towards the school, and once they were finally out of sight, both she and Blake finally let out the laughs they had been holding in. Simply stood there laughing. Ruby felt her nerves fade away slightly, as she knew that nothing she did could compare to the night John was having. "I swear," Blake chuckled after they had finally stopped laughing. "I have no idea how she has so much patience." "He's not all bad," Ruby chuckled alongside the girl, who had slowly turned to continue walking down the path. "He is the one who comes up with the strategies that beat us half the time." "Well, I guess everyone excels at something." Blake smiled with a shake of her head as they started to walk again. "Yup," she said happily, and quickly caught up to her date. "He's not the best fighter, but he's a great leader." Receiving a short hum in response, Ruby began to see the lights of the food court in the distance. Looking up at the girl walking beside her, she noticed her nose twitching slightly and felt a knowing grin pull at her lips. It was good to know that even through the quickly receding nervousness of the date, Blake's love of seafood had the same reaction it always did. Good to know that I'm not the only one that drools when I smell my favorite food, she joked, trying to get a little revenge for the joke Blake had pulled on the roof. I'm not drooling, Blake replied with a small chuckle and a roll of her amber eyes. Unlike you, who actually did drool when you last made a batch of cookies. Well, they smelled so good, she countered happily, as they drew closer to the food court, and the smells of various delicious foods caught her nose. So why do you like fish so much? Watching Blake look up at the dark sky, Ruby saw a small amount of longing float across her eyes, as her nose flared again. It reminds me of home, the fondest girl replied in a soft voice. Menagerie, right? Ruby asked, remembering hearing Blake say she had been born there. What's it like there? Hot and crowded, Blake said fondly, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders a little more. But nice and peaceful since everyone there is tired of fighting. Sounds perfect, Ruby said wistfully, looking away from the girl for the first time in minutes to see that they had almost arrived at the food court. It's nice, but it does have its issues, Blake hummed as they walked into the parking lot. It's a little cramped since there isn't much space, and crops don't grow very well, so we mainly rely on seafood. But my mom makes an amazing seafood paella, so it works out. Ah, so that's why you like fish so much. MHM, the girl replied with a short nod as they reached the doors that opened for them, the smell of food increasing and making Ruby's stomach rumble slightly. So what was it like growing up on Patch? It was fine. Ruby shrugged, not quite sure what to say about the nondescript island that lay just off the Coda Vale. It was pretty quiet, I guess. Our house was in the middle of the forest, so we didn't really have any neighbors. Walking through the door, Ruby squinted slightly at the bright lights, but once she had adjusted, she took a look around the bustling eatery. The area was actually quite large, easily able to fit half a Beacon's student body in it at the same time, maybe more, with basic chairs and tables littering the center of the building. Along the walls were numerous different concession stands, each one dedicated to a different type of food from around the world. Mistralian, Atlesian, things from smaller settlements that had gained popularity. Whatever someone would want to eat, they could find it at one of the stands. Were Grimm not an issue? The occasional Ursa or Beowulf, Ruby replied with a small shrug as the two made their way towards the order screens on the left side of the building. But Dad's a huntsman, so they never really gave us too much trouble. Did break down the wall of Yang's room once fighting an Ursa Major, though. I bet she wasn't happy about that. Blake chuckled in reply, her amber eyes twinkling a little from the amusement. Nope, it kinda just appeared and Dad didn't have time to warn us, so she was still in there, and got wood and dirty all over her hair. Ruby laughed, remembering how red Yang's eyes had been. She was so mad that she even threw small pieces of wood at it as Dad fought it. That sounds like Yang. The fondest girl laughed as they got into the line behind some students. Has she always been like that? Ruby hummed, thinking back as far as she could, and though vaguely memories of her sister's crying being heard through the walls tickled the surface, the memories of Yang smiling and laughing went back as far as she could remember. Pretty much. She even knocked out a Beowulf with a rock when we were kids. She told me about that. Blake smiled, her voice carrying a happy tone as if she were recalling a fond memory of her own. That was the first time you told her that her eyes turned red, right? Kind of. I remember them getting darker before, but that was the first time I saw them actually change. What was it like? The girl asked in a curious tone, the two of them moving closer to the screen as the line moved. I've met a lot of people, but none of them had eye colors that changed. Oh, Ruby replied, not quite knowing how to respond to that question. Honestly, I've never really liked them when they're red. As she had expected, she received a genuinely confused look from her date, and was forced to look away. Do you mind if I ask why? Well, Ruby said thoughtfully, trying her best to think how to word it. I love when Yang is happy, but even though she never talks about them, I know she has those sad moments too. Her red eyes just always reminds me of how there's a whole other side of her that she doesn't want me to see, a side that she deals with alone. Once she had finished explaining herself, a small silence arose between them as Blake mulled over what Ruby had just said. As she waited for the girl to speak, she moved forward ready to order since there was only one person left in front of her. Sorry, she heard Blake say, her cautious voice finally breaking the silence. I suppose I never thought about it like that. Have you ever talked about it with her? Yeah, but you know how Yon is. Ruby shrugged, knowing that she would have to wait until Yon was ready before anything progressed in that regard. I'm guessing she doesn't talk to you either? As expected, she received a shake of the head. Well, hopefully she at least talks to Coco and Velvet. So do I. She seems to really like them, Blake said with a small smile as they finally moved to the screen. So what do you want to eat? What? Ruby said in surprise, halfway to pulling out her own scroll as she looked her date. I can pay. It's fine. Blake smiled and tapped her scroll against the screen, causing it to buffer for a second before pulling up the selection of different stands that were in the building. I was the one who asked you out, after all. Well, I'm paying for the next one then, she replied with a smile at the fact that Blake had indeed been the one who asked her out. Sounds like a plan to me. Blake grinned in return, causing the blush on Ruby's cheek to deepen slightly. You can put yours in first. With a slight nod to her teammate, Ruby quickly tapped on the screen. Ordering her usual plain cheeseburger and fries from the Rimburger menu, she moved aside and watched as Blake quickly pressed a few buttons to order some sushi from the Quisher menu. With everything ordered, the total popped up with their beacon discount, and Blake quickly pressed confirm. Thanks. Ruby smiled as her and Blake began to walk over to a spare table, Blake pressing the scroll against a sensor in the center of it to register it as there, and let the stands know where to bring the food. So do you have any brothers or sisters? While Ruby liked to think she knew quite a lot about her team, Blake had always been a mystery to them all. Not only was she rather secretive about her time in the White Fang, but Ruby had noted she never really talked to family much. Not that she seemed against it, just that while Weiss often spoke of her father, and Jan occasionally spoke of their father, the first mention of the Faunus girl's mother Ruby had heard was earlier that night. Not that I know of, the girl replied slowly, the answer doing nothing but confusing Ruby. I actually haven't really talked to my parents in some time, so I don't really know what their lives have been like. Oh, Ruby said awkwardly, having heard the small hint of sadness that had entered Blake's voice. Not sure how to reply to that information, she tried for the easiest choice that she was certain she knew the answer to. Do you miss them? A lot. Blake sighed with a nod, removing her shawl and placing it aside. Honestly, I doubt they would even pick up if I called. I'm sure they would, Ruby replied, knowing that even Weiss' father picked up when she called, although Weiss did say that wasn't a good thing. You're their daughter. I dunno, Blake said with a little uncertainty to her voice. I didn't exactly leave in the best of ways. I said a lot of things to them that I regret. Did you leave because of the White Fan? The moment Ruby asked the question, Blake closed her eyes, and she knew it was a silent indication that the girl didn't want to talk about it. Taking the hint, Ruby quickly backtracked. Sorry. It's fine, Blake said softly, her eyelids opening to show the shining amber orbs behind them. It's just not a very pleasant subject, one I don't really want to talk about when I would rather be enjoying myself. Stupid Ruby, she thought to herself as she gave the Faunus a small nod of understanding, tapping her fingers together under the table as the thought of anything else they could talk about instead. After a couple minutes of awkward silence, in which Blake gave her a kind smile, she finally managed to find a subject that she considered a little safer. So, she said hesitantly, hoping that it was okay to ask. After you left the WH, your old life behind, why did you choose Beacon? It was the best choice, Blake said simply, and moved aside as a waiter put some drinks on their table. Picking up her cola, Ruby quickly took a sip. I doubt I would fit in very well in Atlas. Vacuole huntsmen and huntresses are treated with quite a bit of skepticism, but Beacon and Haven are actually rather respected. Since Haven was a little too close to headquarters, Beacon was all I had left. That makes sense, Ruby hummed, taking another sip of her drink before putting it down. I'm glad you chose Beacon though. I don't think any of us could imagine this team without you. Well, I am glad you enjoy having me around, Blake said in reply, both of their cheeks turning slightly red at the implications. So what about you? I remember you saying you always wanted to be a huntress. That's quite a big dream for a child to have. Ruby hummed again, thinking back to when she had realized it. I dunno. I think a lot of kids dream about being the hero who saves the day, but for me, it never just felt like a dream. Whenever Jan would read me the stories, she would always tell me what our mom would have done to the bad guys. She'd always tell me that she would kick their butts and save everyone there. She knew how much I miss Mom, so whenever I asked if I could do that one day, she would always tell me I could do whatever I wanted. She would even start to change the stories, so that me and Mom were saving the day together. When I grew up a little, I realized Yon was trying to make sure I understood what Mom thought was worth fighting for. She didn't want me to be mad at her for not being able to be there, but to understand why she couldn't be. Taking a small breath, Ruby looked at her date and gave her a wide smile. So it really was never a dream for me, she shrugged. My entire family helped people, even laid down their lives so that people can continue to live theirs. And I'm proud to continue that. Seeing Blake staring at her a little wide-eyed as she finished, Ruby felt herself blush a little and quickly picked her drink back up to take a big gulp. As she did, she watched Blake's face break into a small smile as the girl looked down at her lap. "Wow," she explained with a soft chuckle and leaned back in her chair slightly. "I knew you were dedicated, but not that much. Wish I was that sure about what I'm doing." "Well, I just want to keep people safe," Ruby countered easily. "I know how to do that, but what you want is much more difficult to do." "I guess," Blake sighed with a shake of her head, though she was still smiling. "Just that some days it feels like I have no idea where to start. How does one person change things after so many years of hate?" Thinking for a second on that question, Ruby found herself stumped. She knew how tough the goal Blake had set for herself was, and while she was determined to help in any way she could, she had never actually thought on how to do that. She could help to save them, but if the fighting between humans and faunus continue, it would only cause the Grimm to become more prevalent than they were already becoming. "I don't know," she finally said, deciding that honesty was the best answer she could give. "But I know you don't have to do it alone. You have a team now, and we have your back." "I know." As Ruby watched Blake give her a genuine smile that made her blush slightly, the waiter arrived once again to place their food on the table. The smell of cooked meat that she had become adjusted to instantly renewed its assault on her nostrils, and Ruby felt her stomach grumble slightly. Reaching out, she pulled her burger and fries towards herself as Blake reached out to take her sushi, albeit more gracefully than she did. She did not. Blake laughed as she pushed her spoon into the sponge cake that was in front of her. Catching her breath, she placed the sponge in her mouth as Ruby talked excitedly. Blake smiled much more than she thought she would have during her past 2 hours of listening to tales of the girl's time on Patch and its signal. But the last 10 minutes, Ruby had been regaling her with tales of her sister. The whole experience had been very foreign to Blake at first, still not being used to the casual atmosphere of hanging out with someone, but the longer it went on, the more she had found herself at ease. There was something about Ruby, a sense of effortlessness that the girl seemed to exude whenever she was lost in her stories, that helped Blake's nerves slide away. As she watched the girl excitedly tell her stories, she had seen the beautiful silver eyes glint in the same way as they had when Ruby found the pack of cookies Blake had snuck into her bag. Every time she saw it, she felt her lips tug into a small smile that only seemed to egg the girl on further, creating a magnificent circle of excitement, and smiling that Blake had no interest in stopping. "She did," Ruby replied happily, stirring the remaining ice cream left in her ice cream sundae. "The fire singed her hair so much that she had to have it cut, and she looked so weird. You know, I don't think I could imagine Yon with short hair if I tried." Blake chuckled and took a sip of her drink. "Well, it only came down to her shoulders, but it was still a bad look for her," Ruby giggled, spooning some melted ice cream into her mouth. "But she looked so lost while she waited for it to grow back and refused to go back to the forge until she unlocked her aura. Now that I believe," Blake grinned as she recalled the trouble the team had every morning. "It's been 6 months, but I still can't believe she takes 30 minutes for her hair alone. That's nothing compared to when we were at home." Ruby hummed with a small shrug, the spoon dangling from the side of her mouth. "I lost count of how many times I had to run to school early to use those showers because I'd have ran out of time if I waited." "Wow." She grinned and ate the final piece of her cake. "And this whole night you almost convinced me that I was jealous I don't have any siblings." "Sorry." Ruby chuckled nervously and stirred the ice cream a little more until all the final lumps turned to liquid. "I guess I talk about Yon a lot." "It's fine," Blake said with a shake of her head as Ruby picked up the tall glass and tipped what had to be nothing but sugaring milk at that point into her mouth. "It's nice that you two are so close." It was true. Over her entire time at Beacon and being part of Team RWBY, the relationship between Ruby and her sister had been one Blake had paid special attention to. Having never had siblings, she had no idea what would be considered normal sibling behavior, but she was fairly certain that they were much closer than your average family, to the point where Blake often mistook Yang's actions to be more motherly than sisterly. It wasn't uncommon for Yang to have to remind her sister to eat, and for the blonde to confiscate cookies and treats until said food was finished. It also wasn't uncommon for Yang to track the younger sister down, whether Ruby was hiding in the kitchen, in the workshop, or even one time when she had been hiding in the back of an unused classroom. It was basic knowledge to the entire team that if Ruby was feeling down, Yang would drop everything to comfort her and do whatever it took to cheer her up. However, for as much as there was a motherly feeling to the relationship, the two were undeniably sisters. Through all of the motherly tendencies Yang showed, there was still an unmistakable immaturity to how they often acted towards each other. From minor falling outs that would be resolved within an hour, to the inside jokes and teasing they usually had that laughing to each other while they played their video games, Blake could see very clearly that neither would let anything happen to separate them. "Well, she's always been there for me," the Red Reaper said matter-of-factly after peering into the now empty glass and putting it aside. "Now that I do believe," Blake chuckled and pulled her shawl over her shoulders. "Are you ready to go?" "Sure," Ruby smiled back and pushed her chair back before his eyes widened a little. "Actually, I need to grab some cookies from Gui Chui. Want to meet me outside?" Not one to stand between Ruby and her cookies, Blake gave the girl a small nod and watched as she took off in a slow jog towards the small stand on the furthest side of the building, and after shaking her head to drag her eyes away from her, she gave an inward smile and made her way to the door. Unfortunately, as she watched the door open and the chilling breeze nip at her face, she knew that date was coming to an end, and while she had certainly enjoyed herself, she had purposely left most of the talking to Ruby. As painful as it had been to remember them, Blake had been more than happy to answer Ruby's questions about her parents. Despite how she had left Menagerie, she had plenty of happy memories with them, and was always happy to relive them. But as the conversation inevitably turned to why she left, Blake knew the conversation would have dragged down the tone of the evening. However, having taken that subject off the table, she had realized just how little she had to talk about. Whether she liked it or not, the White Fang was a huge part of her past. She had been born into it, seen it grow and changed with it. Like Ruby, whose entire life had been about slaying monsters, the entirety of hers had been about fighting for what she believed was right, but those topics weren't date topics. Conversations about rallies where she held signs for hours wasn't an enthralling tale, and all of the ones that did have some excitement were likely not stories Ruby would want to hear. So letting out a deep sigh that caused mist to obscure her vision, she sat down on a bench and pulled the shawl around herself a little tighter. Why couldn't I have just had a normal life? Blake thought to herself a little bitterly. Why did I have to be born fighting? It was a question she had asked herself a lot over the last year. She imagined what it would be like to have been simply able to live happily and have fun with friends, to not have been tagging along with her father for rallies, not that he had ever pushed her to join him. No, that choice was hers. Every past choice she'd made was hers. She had chosen to join those rallies, chosen to abandon the hope of friends who didn't understand why they were so important. And when her parents no longer understood, when the time had come for more action to be taken, she had chosen to leave them behind too. Sure, her admiration of Adam and her desire to make him happy had been a part of that, and those had been the things he manipulated to make her stay so long, but the choice to initially join him had still been hers. Every time felt there was injustice, she rose to fight it, but in doing so, she often tossed aside what she considered unimportant. However, her time at Beacon had changed that. The more she interacted with her team, the more she found herself having that normality she began to crave, the more she realized how important those things she had once unimportant really were. Her parents, her friends, her childhood, she missed all of them more than she had ever thought she would. Blake? So wrapped up in her own thoughts, Blake didn't notice that her team leader had already exited the building and was standing next to the bench looking at her with a slightly concerned look on her face. Are you okay? The younger girl asked cautiously. You look sad. No, Blake replied with a small shake of her head, only to realize how that answer might have come across. I mean, I'm not sad, just got caught up in my own head again. Oh, Ruby sighed, her body visibly relaxing. Do you want to talk about it? You listened to me talk all night, so... It's nothing, I'm just lamenting over the fact that talking about my life isn't really date talk, and wishing that I had other things to talk about like you do. Oh, but then you wouldn't be you. Ruby shrugged and sat down on the bench. I know that your life wasn't exactly pleasant, but I do know you always believed you were fighting for what was right. So not all of your stories can be bad, right? I suppose. Blake sighed, looking at the girl, who was sitting beside her, and receiving a smile. Knowing the girl was patiently waiting to hear one, Blake quickly racked her brain for one that might work. Well, I had this friend, Ilya. We would hang out quite a lot after I ran away. She was probably one of the toughest people I knew, always the first to prove herself, but she was terrified of snakes. One day, we were all sitting around a camp that was actually ran rather well, and a snake slithered over her hand, and in seconds she had jumped into a tree, and because she was a chameleon faunus who could change her colors, she had turned completely pink from embarrassment, even her hair. She hated pink. I remember it was the first time I actually laughed since I left home, Blake said with a smile as she looked down at her lap. She even refused to come down until it was safe, so I joined her on the branch for the rest of the night. That sounds like you and Vi first arrived. Ruby chuckled, causing Blake to groan at the memory of pouncing onto Ruby's bed when the small corgi had dropped from the parcel, something that Blake still considered to be an exceptionally odd occurrence. But it's good to know that even there you had some fun things happen. The last sound was hummed rather cautiously as Ruby pressed her fingers together a little awkwardly. See, can I ask something about faunus? Curious as to what the girl could possibly have to ask that made her nervous, Blake gave the Reaper a small smile and a short nod. So, I haven't really known many faunus as there weren't too many patch, but you don't like dogs and really like fish. Son likes bananas and climbing trees, and you said your friend was a chameleon faunus that was scared of snakes who are natural predators to chameleons. So is liking and hating things the actual animals like or hate a normal faunus thing? Blake hummed at the question that was asked with such genuine nervous intrigue that Blake could help but smile a little. That's kind of a tough one. I wouldn't say it's a normal thing, but definitely not rare. It might be some instinctive remnants from whatever made us evolve differently, but I knew plenty of fish faunus on Menagerie that hated water, and some wolf faunus who hated meat. Oh, okay. Ruby exhaled with a relieved sigh. That wasn't an insensitive question, right? It was fine. Blake chuckled and stood up, turning to face the girl and offering her hand out to help Ruby up. At least you asked, and didn't assume. Blushing slightly, the team leader picked up the bag she had placed on the bench next to her and accepted the hand. Helping Ruby to her feet, Blake knew she probably should have let go, but feeling a rare surge of braveness rush through her, she turned to face the road and took a tiny step forward. Her own blush rose to match her date's as the younger girl took a step forward without dropping to join hands either, though her face was pointedly looking anywhere but her direction. A gentle, yet awkward, silence came over them as they both adjusted to the feeling of the new level of intimacy, both occasionally looking at the other only to look away again with their faces a deeper scarlet than they had been. To add to the awkwardness, Blake was pretty sure she could hear a pair of girls a short distance behind them giggling over the blood pumping in her ears. But if Ruby could them, the girl gave no indication. Instead, she simply moved her hand slightly, so that their hold was a little more comfortable. See, Cookie? The quiet voice was obviously racked with nerves, the small catching a cracking enough that Blake doubted even a deaf person could mistake it. Turning to the stuttering silver-eyed girl, she saw a bag being offered in her direction. There's plain ones. Sure, Blake replied, trying to keep the awkwardness from her voice. Reaching out, she pulled the bag open to look inside and saw a bunch of smaller bags, each holding 5 cookies, as well as one that looked to be a pack of 4 small treats covered in pink icing that she knew were for Yang. Pulling a plain cookie from one of the small bags and covering it back up, she felt it try to bend in her hand from how soft the baked good still was. Taking a small bite, the taste of delicious sugar filled her mouth, and she let out a soft hum. These are really good. Yeah, Ruby said quietly with a small nod and dug a double chocolate chip one out of the bag. They are much better when they're warm. Blake hummed, a question springing to mind as she noticed the gleeful look that pushed through the nervousness as the little Reaper took a large bite out of the cookie. So what is with the cookie obsession? With a mouthful of biscuit, Ruby turned to look at her before quickly chewing and finishing what was in her mouth. The cookie obsession? Ruby repeated thoughtfully and looked down at the bag. My mom used to bake them when she returned from missions, and we would sit and eat them. At least Yang said we did. I kinda remember Mom making them, but not much else. Oh, Blake replied, remembering a conversation where Yang had said Ruby didn't remember much about their mother. Do you remember much else about her? Knowing it was a very personal question, Blake quickly backtracked a little. If you're okay talking about it, I mean. I don't mind talking about my mom. Ruby smiled widely, her head turning away from the road they were walking up so that Blake caught the glint of silver as they passed under a street lamp. But not much really. I know she was amazing. When I really think about her, I mainly remember laughter, Dad smiling as he left the kitchen with her. I know Mom was the reason we moved out to Patch because she loved the island. But everything else, it's so faint that I don't even know if it's real. I can't imagine how that must feel, Blake said quietly to the girl, genuinely trying and failing to imagine what life would have been like had she known she could never talk to her mother again. Do you at least have things to remember her by? Yup, Ruby said with another smile, taking a small bite of the cookie she was still holding and reaching around to the length of red cloth she was rarely seen without. She made me this cape to grow into, and Dad let me have a couple of boxes full of her old clothes. We look a lot alike, so they all suit me, with a couple of my own additions, of course. At least that's something then. MHM, Ruby hummed, and she finished the cookie. Plus Yang, my dad, and my uncle all tell me stories about her, so it's not like I don't know anything about her. Not wanting to voice that she suspected that all three of them likely only ever told Ruby the good things, Blake gave the girl a small nod with a smile and turned back to the road. In the conversation, she had completely forgotten that there was a foreign warmth on her hand, but as a shrill pinging sounded from Ruby's direction, Blake was quickly reminded as the girl looked around for somewhere to place the sweet bag to answer the phone. Before Blake could even offer to take it, Ruby extended a pair of fingers from the joined hands and used them to hold the bag's strings so that she could pull the scroll free and put it on loudspeaker. Almost immediately, the joyous voice of their blonde-haired teammates issued from the small device. Hey, lovebird, the blonde said gleefully, causing Blake to roll her eyes even though she knew Yang couldn't see her. How's things? None of your business, Yang. Ruby pouted and shook her head. What do you want? I got a call from Dad, and he said he is going on a mission tomorrow afternoon. Yang explained quickly, the sound of music starting up in the background. It was last minute, so he didn't have time to send Vi over, so we have to go pick him up early tomorrow morning. So don't stay up too late, all right? Got it. Are you still staying in CDFY's room tonight? Yeah, Yang replied with a stifled yawn. But we'll be leaving around 7-ish so we can pick up some breakfast downtown. All right. Well, I'm off, Yang said. However, Blake picked up that the blonde's voice had acquired the mischievous tone she often found herself dreading. Before I go, Rubes. So you have an excuse to do it. Give Blake a kiss goodnight for me, Will. After a second of stumbling after that request, Ruby hung up the phone, but not before Blake heard the sound of cackling laughter from the other end. Resisting the urge to smile, as a blush crept up Ruby's pale cheeks, Blake reached and plucked the bag from their hands, while Ruby scanned her scroll against a panel on the side of the gate to beacon, so that it opened for them. She really likes trying to embarrass you, doesn't she? Blake said cautiously, still trying to suppress the giggles as Ruby gave her a tired look. Unfortunately, Ruby sighed as they walked through the gate and took the small path to the dormitory building. She's always done it. She says that she has to make up for all the people that aren't allowed to make fun of me because they don't love me enough. That is certainly some young logic, she replied, letting out a chuckle and using what Ruby had just told her to mask the real cause. Yup, the little reaper sighed again, though Blake noted that the sighs weren't sad, but more accepting. Once again, a small silence settled over them as they made their way towards the dormitory and pushed their way through the doors. Since it had just turned 8:30, Blake could hear the sounds of chit-chat flooding from the common area, and determined not to end their night in a crowded, noisy room where they couldn't hear each other, she turned away from it and carried on down the hallway that led to the elevator. Hoping that Weiss was done with what she needed the room for, Blake pressed the button to call the elevator down. Unfortunately, Blake had not thought about her actions enough, so as they stepped into the small space, she became exceedingly aware of how close Ruby was to her. As she noticed it, she also became more aware of how sweaty the hand in her was, and that it was shifting slightly. Curious as to if Ruby wanted to let go, she slackened her grip slightly, and was a little surprised as Ruby slipped her fingers between her own, entwining them as she returned the pressure back to what it was. Feeling her stomach do a small flip at the small gesture, Blake happily reapplied the pressure she had eased up on and felt a small smile pull at her lips. "Be Blake?" she heard Ruby say quietly as the elevator began to move. "MMM," she hummed in return, unable to do much more. Ruby paused, blushing a bright red as she looked away slightly and continued in a very quiet voice. "I really enjoyed tonight." Her eyes widened slightly at Ruby's confession, and in that moment, she felt the fear that her natural withheld nature had made the date boring wash away. Letting out a breath she didn't know she had been holding, she gently applied a little more pressure to the girl's hand and let a smile overtake her face. "I did too." With her own confession said, the atmosphere in the elevator seemed to ease up a little, and enjoying the silence as they rode the elevator, she felt the side of Ruby's head lightly press against her arm. Unfortunately, the moment could only last so long as the elevator gave a loud beep and the door opened to their floor, but a feeling of loss quickly came over her as Ruby's head moved from her arm and the girl made her way out of the small space. Though she really would have liked to have pulled her back and taken another ride to enjoy it a little longer, Blake followed her out, and they made their way back towards their room. As they approached the door, however, Blake remembered what may be going on behind the wooden slab, and not having any interest in walking in on that, she stopped and reached out her hand and gave a short, sharp knock. "You can come in," the familiar voice of the heiress called from inside, as Blake let out a sigh of relief as she pushed open the door. The sight of Weiss lying on the bed greeted them, the snowy-haired heiress wrapped in Neptune's arms, and a blanket thrown over the both of them, as they watched some movie Blake didn't recognize from the small projector that had been placed on the foot of the girl bed. The moment they entered, Weiss' eyes surveyed them until they finally came to a stop on their hands that were still holding each other. "Well then," the girl said, slight amusement in her voice as she sank into Neptune. "I guess I don't have to ask how the date went. Looks like it's a couple's night now." Avoiding the girl's knowing eyes, Blake gave Ruby a small smile, and both of them finally let go of the other, the feeling of emptiness in her hand almost enough to make Blake correct that decision. However, having never been one for public display of affection, which sat holding your date's hand and watching a movie with a close friend most certainly was, Blake let Ruby go to sort out her stuff. Though, she certainly knew she wasn't going to let too long go by until she next had Ruby's hand in hers. Chapter 9. Errands and Uncertainty. If Ruby had thought the chill which hung in the air during her date with Blake had simply been because of the late hour, then she surely would have been mistaken. The moment she and Yang had stepped out of the dormitory building, the sharp, frosty air stung her throat, similar to what she imagined glass shards scraping her throat would feel like and making her wince with each breath she took, and as warm as she cloak was wrapped around her, there was only so much that could be done. So to arrive at the airship that would take them down to Beacon, to feel the warm air that billowed from its vents, Ruby couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief as she dropped into one of the empty seats, Yang sitting next to her and cracking the window open slightly. "Yang!" she whined as she moved her cloak up a little to stop the sliver of cold air it let in from hitting her neck. "It's cold. For you maybe?" Yang groaned, sitting back in her seat and shrugging her jacket off. "But I'm boiling." Despite her words, Yang did push the window closed a little more so that only she could feel the cold air. "So, Rubes, you excited to be going home?" "I went home last month," Ruby replied, giving her sister a small shrug. "It will be nice to see Dad again, though." "MHM," the bulky blonde hummed and stretched her arms above her head. "Still need to talk to him about stuff." Giving her sister a small look, she resisted the frown that tried to pull at her eyebrows. Ruby knew exactly what Yang wanted to talk to their father about. She had known since just after the tournament had ended and Crow had left, and though it had been nearly a month since then, she wasn't too fond of what her sister was thinking of doing. "You still want to do that?" "I don't know, Rubes," Yang replied, the cadence of her voice one of genuine uncertainty. "You said you would be okay with it if I did, though?" "I am," she replied quickly, not wanting Yang to think she was trying to stop her from going. "I mean, I understand why you want to go. I just don't like you going out there alone." "I know." The brawler sighed pleasantly as her arms finally gave a loud pop. "But Coco and Velvet have already said they will come with me if I do go." "You've talked to them about it?" While Ruby was glad Yang was at least talking to someone, she couldn't help but be a little jealous that it wasn't her. "A little." Yang shrugged and rested her arms behind her head to rest on them. I told them why I wanted to go, and they understood, though Velvet really wasn't too happy about the idea of going near Mistral, but she has a good reason for that. Okay. For such a shy and friendly girl, it always felt weird that all of Velvet's friends knew the girl despised Haven and the people that lived there. However, Ruby had never felt the need to ask why, as she knew it was likely something extremely personal. So when are they going to be back anyway? In a couple of days, Yang replied, the sound of relief obvious in her voice. I'll just be glad to have them back, honestly. Ah, Ruby cooed, never one to miss her chance to return the teasing her older sister gave her when given the opportunity. You're so sappy. Shut it. Yang scoffed, and Ruby felt Yang's leg collide playfully with her own. You're one to talk. Weiss told me about you and Blake returning to the room holding hands and being all over each other. What? Ruby replied, blushing red at the implications. We were not all over each other. But you were holding hands? Blushing a deeper scarlet as she was unable to deny that point, Ruby turned away from her sister to hide her face. Unfortunately, the action caused Yang to chuckle loudly at what was basically an admission, and Ruby watched as multiple heads on the airship turned to look at them. I'm guessing the date went well then? MHM. She hummed, pulling her cloak up a little higher and hoping that the redness of her face would help make her blend into it. Aw, you're so cute. Yang chuckled and wiggled her eyebrows as she pulled the cloak back down. So was there any kissy-kissy action? Yang, Ruby whined, earning yet another chuckle from the blonde. I'm taking that as a no. The boisterous blonde grinned and sat back. Shame, she's a good kisser. What? Relax, it was during a game of truth or dare just before the tournament started. Yang chuckled and reached into her bag to pull out the small box of pink strawberry cakes Ruby had bought her last night. The sandpaper tongue did make things a little different, though. She does not have a sandpaper tongue, Ruby tooted, trying her best not to smile at her sister's stupid joke. And how would you know that if there was no kissing, smart Alec? I just know, Ruby replied, sticking out her own tongue and quickly snatching one of the small pink cakes from the box. Yang hummed suspiciously, biting off the top of the icing first. I'm starting to think Weiss lied to me about the no kissing. There was no kissing, Yang, Ruby sighed, taking a bite of her own little cake and groaning as the delicious taste of strawberry sugar filled her mouth. You sound disappointed by that? Yang asked, and while the humorous tone of her voice remained, it shifting slightly to become the more genuine one Ruby had heard so much growing up. Something bad happened to stop it? Nothing bad, Ruby clarified, not wanting Yang to think Blake had been a bad date. I wanted to, but... Letting out a sigh as she slumped in her chair, Ruby pushed the rest of the cake into her mouth and chewed while Yang waited patiently for her to answer, thinking over how she could say what happened without completely embarrassing herself. However, knowing there was no way that was possible, she simply swallowed and resigned to telling her sister the truth. Well, she groaned and threw her wrapper back into Yang's bag. We were in the elevator, and everything was really awkward and stuff. And to stop it, I told her that I really enjoyed the date, and she said she did too. After that, things felt a little better, and I saw her look at me, and I really wanted to kiss her, but it was my first date, so I didn't know how to do it properly, and I was still really scared it was too soon or that I would mess up. Ruby looked up from her lap, where her gaze had naturally fallen to look at her sister after finishing her rushed spiel, and saw her sister looking at her in amusement. Rolling her eyes at the look, Ruby turned away and let herself slide down the chair. Sounds like my first date. Yang grinned and gave her arm a short nudge. Look, Rubes, first kisses aren't going to be like those movies you watch. They're gonna be awkward, and maybe even a little bad, but they're supposed to be. I'm sure Blake knows that too, so if the moment feels right, and you want to, and she wants to, then go for it. The awkwardness almost always sorts itself out with a kiss or two. That doesn't help with the nerves, Yang. The blonde said, her humorous tone dropping completely for a moment, and Ruby knew from experience that meant as serious was coming her way. You really like her, don't you? I do, Ruby replied truthfully, with a small nod of her head. She's strong and smart, and though she hides it, she's really kind. I know she worries about her past a lot, but she wants to be a good person, and I really like that about her. Well then, Yang grinned, the humor returning immediately. I guess I should dig out Mom's wedding dress for you. Shut up. She groaned despite the smile that was spreading over her face due to Yang knowing she intended to wear the dress one day without Ruby having told her. It was one date. I don't even know if Blake wants another one. I mean, she said she enjoyed herself, but that could mean as friends, or as more than friends. Slumping back into her chair, Ruby reaching over and pulled another cake from the box. Why is dating so hard? It's your first date, Rubes. The amused blonde chuckled and brought a leg up so that her foot was resting against the back of the chair in front of him. They get easier, sort of. Besides, she would be crazy to not want another date with you. Letting out a quiet grumble, Ruby took a bite of the cake and thought about what Yang had said. Blake had said she enjoyed herself, and she certainly didn't try to pull away when she had adjusted her hand, nor when she had rested her head against her arm. Those things were definitely not friend things. But were they strong enough indicators that she wanted to keep going? And what would they even do? What did dating people do on second dates? Ugh, she sighed inwardly and stuffed the rest of the cake into her mouth as the airship took off. I should have just kissed her. As she walked into the loud cafeteria, Blake stifled a small yawn with her hand and sat down next to the heiress. The smell of food filled the room, from cooked meat to hot porridge, and Blake's stomach rumbled loudly. If there was one thing she hated about being a huntress in training, it was the fact that all the exercises and sparring made her constantly hungry. No matter how much she ate, or how often, a couple of hours after eating she would always feel like her last meal had been weeks ago. It was especially worse in the mornings when her last meal had in fact been almost 10 hours ago. So when Weiss pushed a steaming hot omelette over to her, Blake couldn't help but feel an immense wave of gratitude. Thanks, she mumbled, still feeling a little groggy from having just woken up. How was your cat nap? Weiss grinned, the girl's energy more annoying than the pun itself. Keep it up, and I will tell Yang how much you secretly love puns. Blake yawned and cut into the soft egg breakfast. You'll have her begging you to marry her constantly. Gods, that idea is nightmare fuel. The girl shivered as she wiped off an apple that had been resting on her tray. She flirts enough as it is. You never tell her to stop, though, Blake retorted, placing a large piece of the tuna and cheese omelet into her mouth and letting out a small groan as the wonderful flavor washed over her taste buds. Because I know she doesn't mean anything by it, Weiss replied with a shrug, using a knife to slice through the apple with practiced ease. It's not like it bothers me anyway. Giving the white-haired girl a hum in response as her mouth was full of delicious food, Blake felt an ear twitch under her bow as she picked up her name being said in a whispered tone. Thanks to her training in the White Fang and growing up in the dangerous outskirts of Mistral, her senses were on constant alert, and having heard her name whispered, the prickling hairs on the back of her neck made her very aware of the eyes that were constantly glancing at her. Focusing her hearing in the direction it was coming from, the voices became loud enough that she could just make out what they were saying. Totally sure? A girl was asking, the tone somewhat disbelieving. Yup, another girl replied without a shadow of doubt in her voice. All the way back to the dorm. Oh, you don't think they... Cutting the voices out, as the two girls erupted in a fit of giggles, Blake opened up her hearing a little further and heard almost the same discussion going on a couple of tables away. Figured that Ruby girl was, but never would have suspected Blake, a boy was saying to his friend, who gave a short scoff. Same, the girl he was talking to replied with an intrigued voice. I was sure she dating that faunus guy from Haven. Nah, he's dating Neon GI. Finally noticed, huh? The last voice was spoken from her side, the close proximity making her start a little despite it being said quietly. Turning to look, she saw Weiss gently carving a snowflake pattern into the uncut side of the apple. I had a girl rush out of the common room to ask me about it this morning. Great, Blake groaned to her teammate and cut a small section of the omelette off to find her appetite had almost completely vanished. Despite the gossip being about something that made her happy, it would undoubtedly draw more attention than she was comfortable with. What did you tell her? The same thing I tell most people who get in my way, the girl replied boredly as she traced the initials J.S into the middle and set it aside. To get out of it. Not doubting for a moment that the interaction had gone exactly as the girl said, Blake gave her an appreciative nod in return. Playing with her food for a couple of seconds as she worked up to continue eating, she felt the eyes on her again and instinctively tensed her faunus ears to keep them as still as she could. Knowing she wouldn't be able to continue her meal, Blake let out a small sigh and pushed her plate away. Do people not know how to mind their business? She asked as her name once again reaching her from across the room. This is a school, Blake. Weiss sighed, her eyes narrowing on the small fruit so that two small, white glyphs made it hover in mid-air and slowly rotate. Of course they don't. Turning to the heiress, who Blake was beginning to notice seemed slightly moodier than usual, she saw another small glyph flickering behind the apple. Flickering glyph were very unusual for Weiss, with her hours of practice every day making them almost as precise as her rapier strikes. But Blake knew there was one glyph Weiss had been struggling with ever since her sister's visit. She had been extremely confused the first time she had seen it, having not expected to walk into the bedroom and see disembodied, shining white head sticking out of a glyph on the ground that had quickly faded to mist. After a thorough telling off from Weiss for breaking her focus though, the girl had explained about the ability to summon that all those with Schnee blood had. Blake also knew that the girl had set aside an hour every day to practice her summoning, and was at least making enough progress with it that she had actually summoned a small Borbatusk. However, if the shimmering of the glyph wasn't enough to show Blake that something was bothering the girl, the gleaming white sword that erupted from it when it had finally stabilized was. While it was small, the summoned metal still cleaved the suspended fruit clean in half, the side with the S carved into it being caught gently, while the other side was left to fall off the table. Everything okay, Weiss? Blake asked, watching the sword vanish into mist as the remaining piece of apple was set on the tray. Yes, the heiress replied, placing the knife she had used to carve the apple on the table. Though admittedly, I would be better if the 2,000 miles I flew to get away from my father actually had an effect. Ah, she breathed, knowing that Weiss' father was always a touchy subject. The girl seemed to absolutely hate the man most of the time, but she very rarely badmouthed him. What did he do this time? Father has decided that I will be flying back to Atlas during our break to perform at a gala. Oh, Blake exclaimed, knowing exactly how much Weiss hated being told what to do, especially by people she didn't like. And I'm guessing you can't get out of it? Unfortunately not, she sighed, a black glyph appearing behind her as she leaned back against it and crossed her arms. He has already organized everything, so to cancel now would reflect badly on us. I guess you three will have to do without me. I'm sorry, Blake said in what she knew was a weak attempt to console the girl, and Blake knew that a part of Weiss' anger was that she was being forced into something. She also knew Weiss enough that the last sentence told her that the girl was also annoyed she wouldn't be joining them at Ruby and Yang's house for the week as Little Reaper had planned. It's not like it's your FA. Well. The unfortunately familiar voice of Cardin Winchester cut Weiss off, the sneer audible in the boy's tone. For someone so quiet, you cause quite a fuss. Get lost, Cardin, Blake groaned, not in the mood to deal with the beacon bully. Touchy today, ain't ya, Belladonna? The boy chuckled, sitting down opposite them on the bench. Though from what I've been hearing, you're a pretty touchy girl. Yet I would still never touch you, she retorted, never one to let someone get the better of her. Come to think of it, I don't recall ever seeing you with a girl. Just cause you don't see it, doesn't mean it ain't happened. The red-headed boy shrugs with an unconvincing smirk. Girls love a leader, but then again, I clearly don't need to tell you that. You know, I often forget that you are the leader of your team. Weiss cut in, her tone still bored but carrying a hint of dangerous annoyance. But then again, I do tend to forget people who lack the ability to even take out a single combatant with their entire team. Not talking to you, Ice Queen. He spat towards the girl, Weiss' words clearly cutting deep as the memory of Weiss destroying the boy's entire team in under a minute last week likely still stung. Though I have certainly heard a fair amount about you and that blue-haired dude. Well, hearing of things is the closest you will ever get to anything with anyone, Weiss replied with a raised eyebrow as her mouth pulled into a cruel smirk. So listen away, all that practice might actually help your spatial awareness. I doubt much could help him there, Blake added to the insult with a grin of her own. All that armor he uses in lieu of actually learning how to defend himself will make sure that never happens. You really want to see how well I can defend mice? Sure, Weiss interrupted coldly before he could finish his angry retort. Doing little more than flicking her finger, a blazing, white glyph appeared on the boy's large chest and flung him backwards. As he crashed into the opposite table, a flicker of blue pulsed around him to show he had in fact managed to activate his aura in time to nullify any damage. Standing up with a furious look in his eyes, He made to charge at Weiss only for a rainbow blur to streak by and send him tumbling over the table instead. "This guy seems like a real bummer, Flint," Neon said in a tone that matched the dulling of her colors. "Don't invite him." "Didn't intend to anyway." A dark-skinned boy Blake recognized as the cat faunus partner, wearing his usual black vest and bright blue undone tie. "You two, however, we promised to party with you sometime." Reaching into one pocket of his pockets, he pulled out a small card and passed it to them. Accepting the card from him, she saw that it was a party invite held at the transfer dormitory on the weekend. "Swing by if you want to have some fun," he smiled, his brown eyes twinkling from the gesture. "Even you, Ice Queen. I'll be playing the music, so maybe you can see some real musical talent." "Oh," Weiss replied, with a scowl at the smirking boy. "Then I think I'll pass. It was barely tolerable during our match. I can't imagine subjecting myself to such torture for any longer than necessary." "Suit yourself, Schnee," he shrugged, though his voice didn't lose any of its cheer. "Hope to see you there, though, Belladonna." "Yeah, it's going to be totally amazing," Neon agreed, somehow sliding up to her partner's side even though she wasn't wearing her rollerblades. "You should bring Ruby and ya." "Half-read bit." Cardin's voice was heard behind them, but before he could say anything else, Flint had turned into a blur of color, his body twisting around and his leg extending forward as he left multicolored clones of himself behind. With one swift kick, the boy once again crashed over the table and Flint's clones collapsed back into him, the only evidence they had ever been there being that his tie was now a bright red. "You're right about him being a bummer, nah," he said coldly as he straightened his vest. "Anyway, we got more invites to hand out. See you two there." With a small wave, both Neon and Flint slowly walked off, as did Cardin, apparently deciding to save what little pride he had left. Once all three had gone, Blake looked down at the card and thought on what Neon had said. She certainly wasn't the partying kind, but it would definitely make a good date that she could take Ruby on, and she was absolutely eager for that second date to be soon. "Like I'm going to attend that," Weiss scoffed, the black glyph she had been maintaining for a backrest disappearing as she stood up from her seat and picking up her tray. "I doubt you will have much choice when Ruby and Yang find out about it," Blake argued while picking up her own plate and following the bobbing ponytail, knowing that the two sisters would definitely drag the heiress along with them. "They wouldn't even let me skip the dance." "Yes, well, you were being stupid then," Weiss countered, her honesty as brutal as always. "I simply don't wish to attend when I could better spend my time studying instead." She hummed as they deposited their trays and plates onto the return section and made their way to the exit. "I think I might go." "Really? It's not like I have any other ideas for a good date." "Well, good luck with that," Weiss said loftily once they were at the doorway, though through it, Blake could definitely make out the sincerity that Weiss always hid. "I am going to the library." "And you?" "Sparring with Sun," she replied and received a short nod from the heiress. Watching Weiss walk away, Blake once again looked down at the card he had given her and thought as to whether it really was a good idea. The idea of a party didn't particularly appeal to her, but she knew Ruby would likely have a good time, and since she also knew that Neon's jazz-obsessed partner would likely at least play some decent music, she pocketed the card with a small smile. I could at least bring it up to her. The frost-chilled wind greeted Yang and Ruby as they stepped out of the airship, the brunette whirling her cape around herself to form a cloak, while her sister zipped up her tan jacket. A thick fog had already begun to blanket the city, the mist becoming so dense in the 10 minutes it had taken them to reach the Vale landing strip that neither of them were able to see much out of their seat's window, and with the combination of the wind and naturally cold air, Ruby was tempted to use her semblance to dash into a nearby coffee store. However, knowing that they only had 20 minutes to catch their boat to Patch, she settled for pulling her cloak a little tighter and followed behind Yang as she made her way through the crowd. Loud noises and the click-clack of wheels on bumpy pavement filled the air as people hurriedly made their way through the large swarm in desperate attempts to get on an airship and escape the cold. Pushing through the horde of busy travelers towards a fleet of waiting taxis, she heard Yang let out a groan as an old woman bumped into her and gave them both a scornful look. "I hate the airstrip," Yang growled as the woman took off with a rude hand gesture. "Stupid law, not allowing me to bring Vi back on Bumblebee when he loves the bike rides." It was true, Ruby remembered when Yang first received her bike, how they had exited the house one day to find the little corgi desperately trying, and failing to get onto the seat. After watching the little corgi try to jump onto the seat for about 5 minutes, Ruby finally relented and gave him a lift up. However, when Yang had told him to get down, even going so far as to rev the engine, Zvi had refused to budge. Never one to back down from a challenge, even if the challenger was a tiny dog, the blonde had thrown her leg over the thin gray bike and launched it forward a couple of feet, earning nothing but a happy bark from the hound. From that day on, the blonde had given the excitable puppy an occasional spin around the backyard. A 2-minute ride around the garden isn't the same as a 2-hour ride through the city and up the trail to Beacon in this weather, Yang, Ruby reasoned to the sullen girl. Besides, I doubt he would fly. Yang! The blonde's name rang out clear over the tumultuous roar crowd, the voice that shouted it incredibly familiar, making the blonde brawler's face break into a wide grin at the sound. Wasting no time as her sister looked around for the source, Ruby hopped up onto a nearby wall and scanned the crowd. It only took a second for her to spot the responsible party. The group of 4 people stood against the wall of a convenience store, was immediately recognizable by the large rabbit ears that stood proudly on top of one of their heads. Yang! She called to get her sister's attention while pointing in the direction of the group that was now waving at her. Over there! Before she could even finish, Yang was already running in the pointed direction, gently pushing each person that was in her way aside as she sought her confirmation. Knowing that she wouldn't be able to make her way through the crowd as easily, Ruby gathered up as much power in her legs as she could and jumped, activating her semblance midair to give herself a large burst of forward momentum. Flying over the crowd, she managed to land just before her sister pushed her way into the small clearing, the blonde instantly pulling the 2 girls of Team CFEY into a bone-crushing hug that Ruby knew very well. Any tighter and Yatsu will have to check our aura. Coco smirked as she returned the hug, seemingly unfazed by the vice-like hug while Velvet seemed to almost be squashed, though the rabbit faunus was still smiling. I don't care, Yang said, Ruby barely hearing the words over the crowd. Taking a step to the side to let her sister enjoy the reunion in peace, she gave the rest of Coco's team a small look over. The most immediate thing that stood out was Yatsu's left arm was in a sling, although he was using the same hand to hold a small treat that was quickly disappearing, so she knew it couldn't have been too badly injured. To his left was Fox, the blind boy seeming to be perfectly healthy, though Ruby noticed he was looking from side to side a little more frequently than he usually did. Hey guys, she said with a smile, giving Yatsu a small wave. Hello, Yatsu replied, his voice low but soft. Hey Speedy, good to see you again. Though Ruby had known the fox for quite some time now, the feeling of his humorous voice ringing clearly in her head despite no words being spoken was still unsettling to her. What happened to your arm? Manticore sting, he replied after swallowing his bite of food. The wound healed, but the damage from the poison is taking some time to go away. Please, Fox's voice chuckled in her head, and from the sideways look the giant gave Fox, she knew he was talking to Yatsu too. He's just wearing the sling to get some sympathy points from Lily. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Fox continued to chuckle as he reached out to snatch some of Yatsu's food, his eyebrows scowling for a second when he missed. If you don't say anything, buddy, she will never know you're interested. That girl is blinder than I am. Smiling as Yatsu shook his head and Fox's eyes widened to show they were now communicating midly, Ruby looked back to see Yang finally pulling away from her girlfriends. The look of relief on her face as she gave Coco and Velvet a kiss each made Ruby smile even more at how happy her sister was. I wasn't expecting you back so soon, Yang said breathlessly as she pulled back and looked at them each in turn. You said it would be a few more days. It was going to, Coco replied smoothly and tossed a drink to Yatsu no passed it to Fox. But we ran into someone from the Vale response team in the inn we were staying at who was getting an early lift back. He offered us a ride. Yeah, we were just waiting for the airships to beacon to start so we could surprise you, Velvet added, her lovely accent making her voice remarkably soft. But Yatsu saw your hair, so I guess this works. So what held you guys up? Ruby asked as Yang pulled the rabbit faunus into another tight hug, though this time Velvet wasn't too squashed to return it. Was it Yatsu's injury? Nah, Coco replied and took a sip of her own drink. We had a pack of shriekers on us and their screams kept attracting other Grimm. But they also ruined Fox's sonar assistant, so he could only move when his semblance was up. Manticores and shriekers? Yang asked in confusion as she pulled back slightly from Velvet. Aren't they normally only found around northern Anima and the vacuole forest of Sanus? Usually they are, Yatsu said with a nod, accepting the drink from Fox and taking a sip for himself. But the Grimm seem to be migrating. A couple of villages we passed through said they've seen Grimm that weren't native to the area recently. That's concerning, Ruby hummed, a little worried about new Grimm that people weren't used to dealing with beginning to trickle into the area. Well, whatever it is, I'm just glad you're back safe. Was there ever any doubt? Coco asked Yang with a smirk, an eyebrow raising over her sunglasses that she wore no matter the weather. Maybe a little, Yang said sheepishly, and scratched the back of her head. Looking away as Coco grabbed her sister's jacket, pulled her into a kiss, Ruby saw Fox fake a gag and flash a smile in her direction, a smile that she knew was meant for her, but the direction he was facing meant it went a little too far to the right. The small joke earned the dark-skinned Joker a tap on the shoulder from Velvet. You have no idea how weird it is to be in someone's head when they do that. I can guess. Ruby chuckled at the boy, though a fresh breeze of wind made a shiver run through her and remind her of what they were actually supposed to be doing. Hey, Yang. We're gonna miss our boat. While it seemed her intrusion had gone unheard as the kiss continued, a couple of seconds later the two girls pulled away from each other and Velvet took Yang's hand. Another couple of seconds passed with them both clearly making sure to reassure Yang that they were really okay, but eventually she gave a small nod of acceptance. Good. Velvet smiled, the three of them coming to a silent understanding. So where are you two going? Home, to pick up Zvi, Yang replied, but hesitated slightly before continuing. Do you want to come? You could meet my dad. You know, if you want to. With them having been dating since shortly after Weiss and Yang took over the preparation for the dance a couple of months ago, Ruby almost worried that the pair would say no. Thankfully she was wrong, and after a shared look, Velvet gave Yang a warm smile and moved over to her side, while Coco addressed her other two teammates. Tell Port we'll be back to debrief later, she told Yatsu and Fox, each one giving a nod in return. But make sure to tell him everything went perfectly. This is the first unsupervised mission they have let us go on since Lower Cairn. And Fox, make sure Yatsu goes to the medical bay before running off to flirt with Lily. How do you know she doesn't assist there? Yatsu said with a smile as he pushed himself off the wall. Such an insignificant detail is easy to wipe from your mind. You would never touch us with that. You barely even use it when asked to. Fox cackled in their heads and raised his hand goodbye. But I'll make sure he gets seen too. Later. Once Fox and Yatsu disappeared into the crowd, Yatsu holding out his arm a little so that Fox wasn't jostled by the crowd, the four of them turned back to each other and made their way towards the taxi at a steady pace. As they walked, Coco placed his arms around Velvet's shoulders, and when they arrived at the station, Yang purposely led them into one that would easily fit them all in the back. So, Ruby, Coco said, her voice taking on a slight teasing tone as they all packed in, Velvet sitting between the two girls. Yang told me you and Blake are now a thing. Oh! Velvet cooed, resting her head against Yang's shoulder as the taxi began to move. Finally! Letting out a sigh and pouting at the chuckling trio, Ruby slumped back in her chair, regretting not having gone for a separate taxi. However, she knew Coco and Velvet were much more interested in Yang since they had just returned, so she simply gave a short nod, and knowing that before long their focus would return to Yang, Ruby's mind drifted to thoughts of Blake before quietly taking a quick nap on the ride to the ferry.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.